Alright, hey guys, it's been a while, but I managed to get top 8 at the BCS Anaheim playing Zorga for standard. So, first off, I cannot take credit for this list. Huge shout out goes out to Ken from KCTCG. Not only did he put me on this deck, but he also pretty much mentored me, not just on how to play this deck, but just how to be a better Vanguard player in general. And then also, of course, I would like to give a shout out to Corey for letting me borrow some of the higher rarity cards, so that way this deck can be fully SP'd out. And also my friends John, Darren, Tim, and a lot of people that I know from SoCal Vanguard. So, without further ado, here is the list. Uh, if you've seen KCTCG's list, it's pretty similar. There's about a one effective card difference, and I'll explain that when we get to it. So, for the ride line, playing, of course, the pretty standard, just starter, ranker chain, black tier husk dragon, and grave equals Zorga. So, 1 and 2s are pretty self-explanatory. Grave equals Zorga, so the red Zorga. So there is some debate between blue and red. Blue is a lot more control, and you have to plan out your turns in advance. Whereas red Zorga, you are able to better sculpt your hand, as well as be aggressive with the first continuous skill. So this is very useful. I just think it's generally better 90% of the time. And then starter could be anything. I did get one person with this, because sometimes they do think you're playing Flagberg, and so they'll discard a perfect guard to it. But most of the time, it's not very that relevant. So, moving on to grade 3s. 3 copies of Persona Ride, pretty standard. And also, this deck goes through quite a lot of soul for the Alpha Magic ability. So, it's very important just to be able to get Persona Ride, not just for the Persona Ride benefits, but just to get that one extra soul that you can use in order to Alpha Magic. Because otherwise, you're going to have a vanilla turn. Then, 2 Roaming Prison Dragon. So, a lot of people like to play more than 2 of this card. And while Roaming Prison Dragon is a very strong card to push and be aggressive with, once you see 2, any other copies tend to just be a brick. And most of the time, anyway, when you're piloting this deck, you don't necessarily need Roaming Prison Dragon to win. So, even if you see 1, or even 0 for that matter, this card is very strong, but you only really need 2, because otherwise it is a brick, it is a grade 3, no shield, and you're playing a deck with a lot of orders, and you don't want to be clogged with these cards in hand. So that's it for 3s. Moving on to 2s, playing 4 Shadow Cloak. This is the MVP of the deck, in my opinion. So, just a spoiler alert, this deck is playing all 1 of orders, and that's what I believe Zorga should be played as. Because the fact that the Shadow Cloak searches for an order and only mills it if you don't have another copy, this effectively makes it so that way, as long as you have orders in your deck, your Shadow Cloaks are always live. Playing multiple copies just turns off the effectiveness of your Shadow Cloak. So, and with the fact that Zorga, or the red Zorga, is able to tutor back any normal order with the hand, so you're able to swap out any cards, this card's utility just goes even further. The second skill is alright. I never really used it. The only time I did was to empty out my soul against a prison player, so that way when they rode up to Pure Light, I didn't have any cards in soul. There are scenarios when you might want to bounce something like Perfect Guard, Persona Ride, or the OT, but in general, I never really used this skill. It's mainly for the first skill. And then the final grade 2 that I'm playing is 2 Clipping Dragon. So this deck is very resource heavy, well, mainly soul heavy. So what this card does is, at the end of your turn, if for the purpose of this deck, if you Alchemy Magic, you put it into the soul and countercharge 1. Countercharge is nice, but the fact that it goes to the soul is what matters the most. And also, it's just a card that you can also play early to be aggressive with. This deck likes to be very aggressive early, kind of push damage, and then you put your opponent in a position to threaten them when they're at 3 or 4 with the Prison Dragons and your large numbers. Now, moving on to the grade 1s, playing 3 Perfect Guards with the 1 Elementaria Sanctitude. This is a grade 3 deck, so of course we're playing this against the grade 4 decks. And also, it does count as an order in the beginning of the turn, or beginning of the game rather, so it does have that extra utility with it, but other than that, pretty standard. Next is 4 Rogue Headhunters. Now, this card is very important in that it is a 13k booster or 13k attacker if you do need it to be. All you need to do is play an order, and also when it's placed on rearguard, it reduces the cost of your deck's Alchemy Magic by 1 counterblast. So again, it helps with filtering, or not necessarily filtering, but saving on your resources. Combined with all the rest of your attackers, so your grade 2s and your own Prison Dragons, it makes a lot of good numbers as well. So I wouldn't really want to cut this card at all. Then the final 2 grade 1s that I play are 2 Bell. So Bell is very helpful in the late game. Because this deck's playing a lot of one-of orders, in the late game you might want to recycle some of them that you've already used throughout the game. And in addition, it does have an additional utility against Eva, because this puts cards from the bind zone back to the drop. So if Eva bound, say, your Prison Dragon, and you have this, you're able to still play and get it back. But overall, this card is very, very good in the late game. Also for pushing numbers in the late game as well, once you have maybe 3 to 4 orders in your bind zone. But the only thing about it is that it's 7k base, so it is a little bit awkward, but combined with something like the effect trigger, it shouldn't be too bad. And speaking of triggers, trigger lineup: 4 crits, 4 fronts, 3 draws, 1 Stoicheia over trigger, and 4 heals. So the effect crits are, in my opinion, kind of necessary. Well, not necessarily necessary, but more so it is nice to have an option to get more soul, especially early on once you're on your first grade 3 turn. Then you might not have a lot of cards in your drop zone to call back with your orders, so just maybe calling this out and then moving into the soul is always a nice option. Fronts, this is a 3 attack deck, so just bolstering the numbers of your rear guards is very nice, but mainly for also the shield. Draws, you do want to see your pieces, as in you want to see your orders, and you want to get through your deck, just because getting through your deck is, I guess, good, you know? Like, you just want to see more PGs, gives you a plus. And you don't want to play more just because there are sometimes risk of decking out, but at least from my experience, that's few and far between. Over trigger, no need to explain that. And then the heals, I did think about playing the 2 counter heals that are for the crits. However, that only really works against Eva and Gravidia, I believe, and so I didn't think that it was necessarily to have it, because while those are really good in the late game, I prefer having just the extra 5k shield in the early game, because I feel like the early game dictates a lot of the flow moving forward. A lot of my games were decided by my early game, so a lot of times I never really missed it. The only time I did was when I played in top 8, and it was a super grindy game, but that was just because, you know, my opponent did manage to get 2 heals to stabilize. But other than that, no real complaints there as well. Now for the orders. So there are effectively 2 types of orders. There's the recursion orders, and then there's the advantage orders. So we'll talk about the recursion orders. So I'll play them out. So, Cloud of Miasma, the Frozen Resentment, Spiritual Body Condensate, and Whales. So, Cloud of Miasma is probably your best order, just being able to counterblast one to get anything back. But on top of that, if it's a part of Alchemagic, to give your Vanguard the static ability of giving your front row units 5k. So combined with Red Zorga's own ability, you effectively give your front row 10k, which helps a lot in pushing high numbers. A lot of my opponents were very surprised on my rear guards hitting 33, 38, 48 columns, so this is pretty nice. These two orders right here, these do cost a soul, which can be a little iffy at times when pairing it up with other things. But the main part about this is that they are orders that you can play early. So if you need a rush and say maybe get out like an early Roving Prison Dragon, these help with that. You only need one of each. This one giving the unit you called extra 5k. So if you need a push or if you need to go through the deck and or thin it out, you go into the Frozen Resentment. And the Whales is the one difference between mine and Ken's list. He's playing the Blitz order. I'm playing this. Now, this says that your opponent chooses one of their rear guards and retires it, and then you get to call a unit from your drop with the same grade. Now, this does have a non-bow against, let's say, Eva with the grade 1 research because you can't retire it. But the main point of this card is that it is an order with no cost. So there are times when maybe you're low on counterblast, say you've used a lot the previous turn or your opponent damage denied, and also you only have one soul, so you need to use that one soul for your Alchemagic. So just having this card is nice for fitting in when your resources are a little bit awkward. Now moving on to the other orders, the one Tearful Malice. Tearful Malice is very useful for just getting back general resources, getting you back a counterblast, a soul, and replacing itself is very nice. But the main purpose of this is also just to reset any roaming prison dragons you do have. And you only need the one because playing multiple of it, you're giving up a lot more of your board. And as you can see, there's only so many cards that revive back. It's not like Blue Zorga where you can just counterblast one and get a unit back. So just the one is good. The one, Gather Upon Me, You Wandering Souls. This discards an order from your hand to give your Vanguard +1 drive. It is a grade 2 order, so you are able to play this as early on your turn 2 to give your grade 2 twin drive effectively. This is only really useful if your hand already has a lot of orders, or if you need to pressure your opponent with the triple drive as well, because if you have 2 columns with roaming prison dragons, those are usually 38s with the rogue headhunters, and with your Vanguard having triple drive, your opponent has to weigh what triggers you might get and so on and so forth. So just only one of that. The one Sweets That Becomes an Evil Dream. This is a cantrip if you're familiar with the terms. It just means that it replaces itself with the counterblast. You draw a card and then you look at the top card of your deck and then you either leave it there or you discard it. So this is helpful for checking triggers and I guess ordering your attacks. I did over the course of the tournament. 2 times that it was relevant. I saw a crit, so obviously I just left it there, and then I also saw a perfect guard that I needed. I left it there, and my opponent had to wonder what it was, so they overguarded my Vanguard when it was just a perfect guard for the upcoming turn. And then we have the Death Inviting Black Magic. This is essentially Pot of Greed. It is Counterblast 4, but its cost is reduced by 1 Counterblast for each card in your bind zone, and it's simply just a draw 2. So the draw 2 is very helpful when you need extra cards. There are times when you only have maybe like 3 or 4 cards, and if you're a little iffy about, not finishing off your opponent this turn, this is a really good card, especially in the late game when you have a lot of your order cards bound already from Alchemagic. Also, there was one time against Eva where they bound 2 cards, so I was able to play this card very early on to get an additional plus. But overall, it's not the best card, but there are situations in which it is good. And then the last order that I'm playing is the Overcoming the Unnatural Death. This card reads that it just salvages 2 orders, so 2 normal orders. Oh wait, no, it's just 2 orders. So it's counterblast 1. You bind this card and you choose up to 2 order cards from your drop and you put them into your hand. So this is also useful for getting back your Elementarias if you damaged it, or if you damaged and healed it, or you discarded it for something else, let's say your ride line. You can do this to get it back. So again, it's also a grade 1 order that you can play early and helps you set up for future turns as well. So overall, this deck is very fun. I really like this deck. It's very skill intensive in a way, in that there are a lot of different lines and adaptations that you can make throughout the game, because you're not stuck with just one type of play. As you can see, there are multiple lines. Even though a lot of times you are looping the Clouded Miasma, there are situations in that it's not correct. You might go for something like Gather Upon Me with the Death Inviting to get even more cards in hand, or so forth. So overall, this is a very rewarding deck to play, and I've been grinding this deck for the better half a year or so, and I felt that it really paid off. So yeah, this is the deck that I ended up playing and placing top 8 at BCS Anaheim for Standard. I never really felt that there was any matchup that was very difficult. Even the Eva matchup was pretty easy for me, to, in all honesty. The only time that I only felt kind of threatened by it was when it got in the super late game. But again, that was because my opponent got 2 heals over the course of 2 turns. He was able to stabilize, and I kind of ran out of gas from that point. But it is what it is. I am still very proud of how far I did get with this deck, and getting an X1 in Swiss and placing second after 9 rounds. So yeah, if you do want more advice on this deck, I would highly recommend looking up KCTCG, and Ken is a way better pilot than me. I still have a lot to learn about this deck, but yeah, that'll be it for me, and thank you for watching.